At The Nocturnist, we are careful to ensure that all stories comply with healthcare privacy laws. Details may have been changed to ensure patient confidentiality. All views expressed are those of the person speaking and not their employer.
When a patient dies in the hospital, I pronounce him dead, comfort the family, switch off the monitors, pull the curtain shut, and then move on to my next job. But the story doesn't end there. What happens to the patient's body next? I'm Emily Silverman, and this is The Nocturnists, stories about what it's like to work in medicine. In this episode, hospital administrator Galen Laserson recounts the time she got an unexpected phone call in the middle of the night, which prompted her to learn all about the hospital's underbelly, the morgue. Afterward, we talk about the world of hospital administration and then end with a surprising piece of news about Galen's career path. Here is her story.
So I'd like you to remember the first time that your pager went off. Where were you? How did you feel? What was the call? For me, it was 1:30 in the morning on a Wednesday, and I was dead asleep. And I jolted awake in my bed, and I grabbed the pager, and I started pushing buttons frantically, trying to read the message, and terrified that I would delete it. So every week, a hospital executive serves as the administrator on call, the AOC, responsible for managing any major operational issues or crises that come up. For the most part, the AOC pager doesn't go off that frequently. Most departments, IT, facilities, nursing, let's say, handle issues on their own or with some help from the on-site hospital supervisor. For an issue to get to the AOC, something's gone awry. This is the management equivalent of multi-system organ failure. So, as you'd expect, we debrief after every call to make sure that the issues don't repeat themselves. So as a new fellow in hospital administration, the only thing I could be certain of when I answered a page was that it would be something I had never dealt with before. So we're back to Wednesday at 1:30 a.m., and I return the page, and I say, "This is Galen Laserson, first responder AOC. What seems to be the problem?" And then the hospital supervisor tells me the refrigerator's broken. I think, okay. I think that doesn't seem like such a big deal. Which refrigerator? And she tells me, the morgue. Lesson number 1, the morgue is a fridge, not a freezer. Now, they didn't cover this one in business school, so I start with a strategy that my friend Nicole swears got her through her intern year. I see. Now, what do you normally do when that happens? No luck. Morgue's been trucking along just fine for about 15 years, and as an added bonus, the hospital supervisor now thinks I'm incompetent. So, when in doubt, it's always a good idea to start with nursing. And I call the nursing supervisor, and I say, we have a bit of a situation. This might be hard, but if you had to estimate, how many people do you think we might, lose tonight? And she says, tonight? Pretty matter-of-factly, 1, Mr. James on the 13th floor. Wow, okay, that was specific. So, got it, need room for Mr. James. But even more pressing was what we were going to do with the body that was coming out of organ harvesting shortly. This was like a macabre math problem. Did I want 1 very warm body in the morgue anteroom plus 16 cool ones in the morgue refrigerator, or did I open the door and land myself with 17 lukewarm bodies? Well, I said to the nursing supervisor, what if we open the door and we just put the body in really, really quickly? And it wasn't the most scientific approach, but it didn't seem any worse than any other option we had. So with that covered, I called facilities and pathology, and we agreed on a morning meeting in the morgue to come up with a plan. So the next morning, I arrive at the morgue a little early because, I was awake. I went and looked at the morgue refrigerator, and temperature had gone up by about 6 degrees, and I was back at the math. So, if we normally store bodies at 2 degrees Celsius, and the morgue's now at 14 degrees Celsius, and it's rising at a rate of 1.5 degrees every hour, I was going to have a really big problem on my hands in about 5 hours. Although, what actually happens to bodies when they get warm? I asked the pathologist, I was like, do they smell? Is it a really bad smell? Lesson number 2, it's not that warm bodies smell, it's that they drip fluid everywhere. So facilities is waiting on a part from the manufacturer, and we start to come up with alternative contingency plans. Someone suggests the Laboratory Animal Research Center. Lesson number 3, we have a morgue for animals, which, incidentally, was working just fine. So the question is, could we move some of the bodies to the morgue for the animals just temporarily? And one look around at the faces in the room made the answer to that pretty clear. I mean, yes, but no. No, we can't. So start to think, okay, is there another way to handle this? And for that, I had to seek out patient relations. Now, when a patient dies on a medical television show, which, of course, they almost never do, we see the physician inform the family of the death, and maybe we see the patient's family's reaction. I always wish we could stay with the family and see what happens next. In the hospital, what happens next for the family falls into the realm of patient relations, specifically decedent affairs, who are the experts in logistics. Death leaves the living with a surprising number of logistics. I remember sitting with my friend Shireen a few years ago. My stepfather had died around the same time as her mother, and amidst all of this, we found ourselves discussing logistics. What do you do with the body? Who calls family friends to let them know? How do you get a death certificate or plan the service, place an obituary? I used to think that bereavement leave existed because it's so hard for us to do anything or to function when we are grieving. I didn't realize it was because there's so much stuff to get done. Assuming, of course, that there's someone there to do it. When I looked at the list of patients in the morgue, I thought there must be some kind of mistake. There were patients listed who had died in December, and we were now approaching February. Lesson number 4, patients can hang out in the morgue for a while. When a patient dies without family, it's the Office of Public Administration that's tasked with tracking down the next of kin. And this can take a while. They could go to the city morgue, but this is San Francisco, and unfortunately, even the morgue has a wait list. So, sure enough, before the sun has risen, we came up with a plan that everybody agreed on. And decedent affairs would call the mortuaries to pick up the bodies. Nursing would move the neonatal bodies into a smaller working refrigerator upstairs. And facilities anticipated having the repair completed by the end of the day. And if not, they were going to look into the option of refrigerated trucks. So I emerged from the morgue into a hallway full of staff in light blue scrubs doing pre-dawn yoga before the start of the morning shift. And there was something that made sense about that much vibrant, peaceful life on the other side of the wall from death. I watched them for a few minutes. Then I went upstairs to my boss's office to debrief him on the plan. That was when I learned lesson number 5. There's an AOC emergency manual, and it has a protocol titled Morgue.
So I am sitting here with Galen Laserson. Welcome.
Thank you.
I loved the story that you told at our event, and I'm so excited to have you here just to kind of talk it out a bit. But before we get into your story, I'd like to ask a little bit about you. And one of the things I love about you is that actually the fact that you're not a doctor, and Normally our events are mostly doctors telling stories, but I love it when we pepper through other healthcare professionals in other disciplines. Mm-hmm. And so you came to tell the story as a hospital administrator. How did you come into the world of hospital administration, and what was that journey like for you?
Hospital administration for me was a long journey. I've always had a fascination with healthcare, which for me started because I loved hiking in college, and I became a wilderness first responder as part of a program to lead hiking trips, and taught wilderness first aid, and eventually thought it would be interesting to find out what medicine was like when your key concerns were not hypothermia or lightning. And so I did a summer internship volunteering in the emergency department down at New York Downtown Hospital, which is right between Chinatown and Wall Street, so two very different patient populations. And I had some mentors there who made me start to think about hospitals as a small city, as a very heterogeneous environment that has a lot of people from different backgrounds with different training running this institution. And I kept it in the back of my mind because I was a religion major in college, and I ended up going into finance. And I thought, well, this will just be this hobby, this interest in healthcare. And after a while working in business, I got to more of the conclusion that healthcare was also a business and something that I was really passionate about. And I thought, well, if I can take these skills that I've gotten from working in finance to this other industry, that could be a really good fit. So I went to business school with the idea that I wanted to change the industry that I was working in and move into healthcare. And while I was there, I found out more about hospital administration, and that these types of fellowships existed where you could really go into a hospital and see all of the different areas that you could possibly work in.
So when you were telling the story, you were in the middle of this fellowship.
I was.
And so coming into the world of hospital administration, was there anything about the hospital environment that surprised you, or something that you learned that you weren't expecting?
Everything about it. And I think that was part of it, was saying before I could form what I wanted to do in my career in hospital administration, it was getting inside this environment that is pretty nebulous and understanding the difference between the different areas of hospital administration, so that there is ambulatory versus inpatient, and strategy versus operations, and adult versus pediatric, and how do all of those areas interact. I think every time you go into an environment where you are a bit of a fish out of water and you have a background that's different from the other people who are there, it's this incredible learning opportunity. And I found that coming from a liberal arts major and working in banking, and I found that I really enjoyed that in hospital administration.
And you said there were also moments where, you would get a call and then you would enter a part of the hospital that you had never been in before. Mm-hmm. And one of the parts that you entered was the morgue, and mm-hmm. that's what you told your story about. But what are some other parts of the hospital, maybe that I don't even know exist, that you were exposed to during your fellowship?
The sterile processing department.
What is that?
It's this fascinating operation where all of the instruments that are used in the OR and other places in the hospital are sterilized, and the staff there has a very systematic way of also putting together all of the kits that go into the OR. And so when you go in, you have your gown and your hat and everything on, and they have multiple levels and complicated machines that heat things up to temperatures of extreme degrees under various pressure. I think material services. Sometimes I actually would find myself in places of the hospital entirely by accident because I took a wrong turn. I think you learn about the type of different refrigerators you have in various ORs, and what's the difference between a specimen refrigerator and one that keeps tissues cold. That was something that we also had an issue with. I think it's also learning different processes in the hospital. So one of the first calls I had to do with an overage of a number of people calling in sick, and you learn about the staffing procedures of the hospital and the rules around patient to nursing ratio, and who do we have to have on various floors for what, and who can you shift in different places to make sure that the hospital runs. Another example that comes to mind is we had a blackout one time. And what are the relationships between the hospital and different agencies within the city, whether it's the emergency medical system or police or other agencies.
It really is like its own little city, isn't it?
Yes, very much
Just
so.
its own police force, and it kind of almost reminds me of a TV show like Downton Abbey or something, where there's like all these different layers and all these different levels, and there's the beautiful areas, and then there's kind of the dark underbelly where all the hard work is done. And I've been working in hospitals for the last 7 years straight, and I've really only been exposed to a sliver of that city. I would like to maybe zoom in a little bit or narrow in on this journey that you took to the morgue and talk a little bit about your backstage tour of death and the logistics of death. Can you tell me a little bit about, what did you know about the logistics of death before you got that call?
I knew almost nothing about the logistics of death, minus the fact that I had done some work on the hospital census. So I had a sense of how many people leave the hospital alive and how many people don't from a numbers perspective. I didn't know where the morgue was, and I didn't at that point want to ask, so I sort of had to look it up, and that was one of the reasons why I was there early. So I hadn't been there, and I had this picture in my head of a morgue from, I think more from a CSI or an SVU or other perspectives, that it would be this one room. And I walked in, and it's unremarkable in the basement of the hospital, and there was a larger area than I thought where autopsies and other things can happen. And then there was the refrigerator itself, and then there's an area there where the family members who weren't present can come down and identify patients, and that was a whole another thing I hadn't thought about. And some of it comes up in the story about what happens to the patients next. I think one of the most surprising things to me was the backup that can happen, how long they stay, which is one of the things I mentioned in the story, but also who manages how patients get out to the mortuaries. And they don't usually pick up on the weekends, but we could call them to have them pick up faster, and that process of it, and how the paperwork is done. Any of it, I didn't really have a great sense of it, and how many people were involved in it.
I've never been to the morgue. And when I imagine what it looks like in my mind, I imagine a wall with rectangular drawers where there's a handle and you pull out a drawer and then there's a body in the drawer. Is that what it's like?
That wasn't what it was. That's not what ours looks like.
So when you say there's a refrigerator, can you paint a picture for us of what is this refrigerator? How big is it, and what's inside?
I will do my best. It was a while ago now, but you open the door and you can walk into the space. And I remember that it wasn't individual drawers, but that it was more of a window that you could see through, where there were a number of bodies, not sort of haphazardly stacked. There were a number of them that were in individual trays, I guess you would call it, but it was smaller than I expected.
And you're physically standing in the refrigerator, so it's kind of like you walk into an ice box. Is that?
It is. I think also the other piece was, for whatever reason, I thought it was a freezer, and it turned out that it was more of a refrigerator. I didn't, because the issue that we were having was trying to keep that door closed, which oddly enough made me think of your refrigerator in a hurricane, where you're like, well, I don't want the food to spoil. So I didn't go in, but I looked more from the outside.
I see. And when you were down there, what kind of emotional state were you in? Were you just kind of like, there's a problem, I need to solve it? Or did you go down there and did you have sort of like a spiritual feeling in your gut, like, wow, I'm being surrounded by all this death? Or what were you feeling at the time?
It was one of the earlier calls that I had as AOC. It was the second one. I hadn't been at the hospital all that long, so I think my first feeling was don't screw this up. And I remember thinking, I'm out of place here because it's not an area I'm familiar with. So I think my first feeling was, what do I need to know to be able to do my part in this position? You're asking questions that you can't believe you're saying out loud. Like, how many people are going to die tonight? Or, what happens to the bodies? And you are asking them in an important way, but sort of casually talking about death. And I think in our culture, we don't really talk about it at all. So it was becoming comfortable asking those questions. It's much easier to ask some of the other questions that come up. When you're in a blackout, you go to the, ED and say, how many patients do you have that are on, electrical equipment? And it's a lot more sensible operationally. And I was much more comfortable with operations. And this was a different type of operations.
Right. In the end, it's all operations.
Yes. So the spiritual piece of it came to me afterwards.
In the story, you mention dealing with your stepfather's death. When did that happen in relation to your experience in the morgue, and how did that inform the process that you went through in trying to solve this problem?
So I found out about that at my graduation from business school. And I gave a eulogy at his memorial service. And I think it was the person I was closest to who had died when I was an adult. So that was in my mind a little bit during this process, because what I had was more of a personal experience than professional.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Especially in the situation that we discussed, where you might have contacted somebody who hasn't been in touch, a next of kin. And there's a couch down in the morgue that you can sit on, and it was covered with vinyl and plastic. And I remember the pathology administrator, we were sitting on it having a conversation, and I just saw her write down on her notebook, more comfortable couch. And it was, I noted that she was thinking about what I was thinking about, which was what would be the experience of, what are we using this couch for, and what would be the experience of somebody sitting on it, and that experience would be finding out that your loved one has died.
Right. And I think because, death is universal, when you're dealing with it professionally, more likely than not, there's going to be some sort of personal history to refer to or to latch on to. And that definitely happens, when I'm dealing with patients who are dying. And I sense that, when you're dealing with death from a logistical or operations standpoint, there's just a disconnect between like the emotional intimacy of losing someone that you love and then the, operational side of it.
One of the other things I do is I'm a volunteer EMT, and one of the aspects of that training that you talk about is that it's not your emergency, and being able to put that aside helps you better serve the patient, because you need to be calm and in control of the situation. And that's one of the differences between the operation, the professional and the personal. And for me, when I was in the morgue, it was in a professional capacity. But I think with being an EMT, when people are calling 911, it's an emergency every time.
Right. And I love this concept of, when somebody calls 911, it's always an emergency. And then when you're on the receiving end of those calls, it's kind of like having an emergency 12 or 15 times a day, or however many times 911 is called.
Although the more you hear it, the more you realize the wide range of things people call 911 for,
may or may not,
which may or may not qualify as an emergency, but it's an emergency to them.
Right.
Which is, I think, the key aspect of it.
What happened? It sounds like at the end of the story, you walk into your boss's office to explain all of the great work that you've done overnight to problem solve, and then you realize that the entire time there was this protocol, and you said you were looking into the options of refrigerated trucks. What ended up happening? How did this story resolve?
Somewhat uneventfully, they fixed the morgue and the transfer of the patients that we needed to transfer had already happened. So it wrapped itself up later that day. And as we do with all emergencies, we had a debrief of that conversation, one of which is that the administrative fellow should know where that manual is.
Where is the manual?
Well, the particular one that we were referencing was in my boss's office, who has this incredible ability to find pieces of paper from 20 years ago all in one place. He has a great system. So we looked through that, and actually many of the things that we did were exactly what was on that list. The people who run facilities and who run pathology had a pretty good sense of what to do. And a lot of my job was just bringing them together.
You had good instincts, it sounds like. So I'm glad it all worked out. And then I think I want to end with the plot twist for you and for your career path. Can you tell the audience a little bit about some of the decision-making that went on after you finished your fellowship?
Yes. So after I finished my fellowship, I actually had the pleasure of continuing on in an operational and strategic role for the next 2 years. So I ended up completing 4 years in hospital administration, at the end of which I decided to change paths and go to medical school and become a physician myself. And I think it was a decision that was a long time coming and a difficult one because I had loved the work that I did in hospital administration. But partly it was stories like The Nocturnists and hearing more about the individual patient care and being able to influence patients in that way that helped to drive that decision. And it was also just a nagging thing at me for every 2.5 years that I would think about that. I finally said, okay, well, I need to do this, or I need to let it go. And in particular, working in the clinic had given me a lot of exposure to patients, and I talked to them about just about everything except their medical care, and realized that was a piece that I really wanted to be able to be involved in. The other aspect that I learned was essentially anytime you're dressed in scrubs, you are a physician from the patient's perspective. So I had one situation where I was doing an operational analysis of patients going through orthopedic surgery. And at the beginning, I introduced myself and told them who I was and what my role was. So the first question, I said, do you have any questions for me? And this is what I'm here to do. And the patient said, yes. Do you know what type of cement they're going to be using on my hip and exactly how that's going to work? And I thought to myself, oh, yes, I know the answer to that, and no, I can't say anything to you about it. Unlike in business where you're allowed to guess at things, they really don't like it in hospitals when you talk about something you're not qualified for. And so it was part of that desire, realizing how interested I was in the patient care, and then just generally how interested I was in medicine. I found myself in that project, I needed to observe 4 or 5 surgeries, and somewhere around 7 or 8, I realized I was sneaking into rooms I didn't necessarily need to be in because I just had this fascination with medicine. And I think part of what was really a joy was getting to work closely with doctors from all different specialties.
Well, I think the profession of medicine is lucky to have you. And, I have to say you'll be coming into the whole medical school path with a huge advantage, just having this 20,000-foot view of the healthcare system.
Thank you. I think it is a long road, and I'm at the very start of it, but it's exciting when you're finally doing something that you've been thinking about doing for such a long time.
Thank you so much for speaking with me, Galen.
Thank you for having me. It's been a lot of fun.
That was Galen Laserson. Thank you so much for listening to our show. This is actually our second to last episode of the season, and I'm really stoked to be bringing you the season finale in a couple of weeks. It's a good one. And don't worry, we had a couple of really awesome events in February and April, so we have a ton of material to put together a great season 2 for you sometime in the future. In the meantime, if you want more, check out the awesome medical podcasts House of Pod and the Short Coat Podcast. The first is a bunch of doctors sitting around talking about interesting topics, and the second is a bunch of medical students sitting around and talking about interesting topics. They're both fabulous, and I was actually featured on both shows as a guest earlier this month talking all about the Nocturnist Project, so go ahead and check out those shows as well, and you can find links to their shows in the show notes. As we prepare for the next steps of our show, it would mean a lot to us to hear your thoughts and feedback. So please send us a note through our website at www.thenocturnist.com. We really love hearing from our listeners. Seriously. I want to thank executive producer Allie Block, podcast producer Marina Poole, Emily Shaw, Celine Ross, Stephanie Muscat, and Yosef Monroe and Blue Dot Sessions for the music. See you in a couple weeks.